On December 1941, while J. Edgar Hoover's FBI chased shadows on the streets of New York, the real decisive war against Nazi espionage in America was being fought in the crowded, secret rooms of a former girls' school in Virginia. In total secrecy, hundreds of young women worked at Arlington Hall, listening to the enemy's most intimate whispers. They were America's most effective weapon against the Third Reich, and they were almost fired by the very men who couldn't believe they were right. This is the hidden story of the intellectual conflict that raged inside America's top-secret code-breaking center. The battle was not between nations, but between a brilliant secret sisterhood of female cryptanalysts who could see the invisible patterns in the supposedly unbreakable Enigma code, and their skeptical male military superiors who repeatedly dismissed the women's vital findings as feminine intuition. This internal rivalry risked an intelligence failure that could have cost America the war. In this documentary, we will reveal the newly declassified history of Arlington Hall, uncover the specific Nazi spy rings the women exposed, and detail how the deep-seated prejudice of their superiors led to a critical near miss, a secret failure that was covered up for decades. In the first stunned months after December 7, 1941, the United States was a nation gripped by a paralyzing fear, not just of the empires it now faced overseas, but of the enemy within. The shock of Pearl Harbor was absolute, proving that America was vulnerable to a devastating surprise attack. This vulnerability created a wave of paranoia that swept the nation. Newspapers were filled with sensational stories of sabotage and espionage. Rumors flew of German U-boats landing agents on the foggy shores of New England, and of Japanese spies signaling fleets from the hills of California. J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious director of the FBI, fanned these flames, positioning his agents as the nation's frontline defense against this fifth column. But while Hoover's men staged public arrests and chased leads on the ground, the real threat was invisible, communicated in a language no one could understand. It was a torrent of encoded radio messages, billions of bits of encrypted data flowing from Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome, as well as from clandestine transmitters hidden within North and South America. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service, or SIS, the organization responsible for intercepting and breaking these codes, was dangerously unprepared. It was a small, underfunded, and almost entirely male enclave, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer volume and complexity of Axis communications. They were staring at a brick wall of gibberish. The German Enigma machine, with its billions of possible settings, was considered practically unbreakable. The Japanese purple diplomatic cipher was a similar enigma. America was flying blind. It was intercepting thousands of enemy messages a day, but understanding almost none of them, leaving the nation defenseless against the next coordinated attack, the next U-boat wolf pack, or the next saboteur. The old methods, reliant on a small cadre of specialists, had failed. A new kind of thinking and a new kind of workforce was desperately needed. The inciting incident for this intellectual revolution came not from a military order, but from a quiet, radical gamble made by a few brilliant men. Most notably, the father of American cryptology, William Friedman. Friedman and his colleagues in the SIS were geniuses, but they were drowning. They knew they needed to scale their operation from a boutique workshop into an industrial-scale factory of decryption. To do this, they needed a massive influx of new minds. But where to find them? Every able-bodied man with a mathematical or engineering background was being drafted for combat or funneled into weapons development. So, Friedman looked where no one else in the military establishment dared to the nation's women. He and his colleagues theorized that women, particularly those with backgrounds in mathematics, languages, and even music, possessed the ideal and critically overlooked traits for this new kind of war. They believed women had superior patience for mind-numbing, monotonous work, a meticulous attention to detail, and, as the male-dominated leadership of the time perceived it, a lack of ego that would make them better, more seamless collaborators than their competitive male counterparts. This was a radical theory, and it was put into action with stunning speed and secrecy. Recruiters were quietly dispatched to the Seven Sisters, elite women's colleges like Vassar, Smith, Wellesley, and Goucher. They didn't post flyers. They met with deans and professors, asking them to recommend their sharpest, most dependable senior girls for a secret, patriotic government job. The young women were told nothing about the work itself, only that it was vital to the war effort, and that they must never, ever speak of it. Lured by the promise of serving their country in a meaningful way, they arrived in Washington, D.C. by the hundreds, then thousands, and were shuttled to Arlington Hall, a recently seized and converted girls' junior college in Virginia. The scene was surreal, a genteel campus of brick buildings, suddenly encircled by barbed wire, searchlights, and armed military guards. To the old guard of the Army and Navy brass, this move was seen as Friedman's folly, a kindergarten of codebreakers, a secretarial pool masquerading as an intelligence unit. They had no idea that this secret sisterhood would become the industrial-scale brain that would win the intelligence war. This is where the video's central conflict begins, not against Germany, but inside the very walls of Arlington Hall. The women arrived, eager to contribute, and immediately collided with a rigid, immovable wall of institutional prejudice. The military hierarchy was absolute. The Army and Navy code-breaking units were run by career officers, men who had come up through a system that valued seniority and conformity above all. They simply did not know what to do with thousands of brilliant, college-educated women. In their minds, women in uniform, or in civilian government service, performed one function: clerical support. The women were initially assigned tasks to match this prejudice. They were set to filing, typing, sorting intercepts, and operating the bulky, loud IBM tabulating machines that sorted data. They were the support staff, not the analysts. The real intellectual work of cryptanalysis, the actual breaking of the codes, was reserved for the men, many of whom were far less qualified than the female math and language graduates they were now ordering around. Personal accounts from this era are filled with stories of this deep-seated bias. A woman who, through her own initiative, found a pattern or a potential breakthrough in a code would be told by her male superior to check her work again, dear. He would then take her findings, rerun the calculations himself, and if they proved correct, he would present the breakthrough as his own at the next briefing, with the woman's name nowhere to be found. This wasn't just casual sexism. It was a systemic theft of intellectual property. Women were frequently denied access to the big picture intelligence, given only fragmented, compartmentalized pieces of code to work on, making it infinitely harder to see the patterns. They worked in poorly ventilated, overcrowded rooms, often in basements, in 12-hour shifts around the clock. The message from the establishment was loud and clear. You are temporary. You are expendable. And you are not to be trusted with the real secrets of this war. This daily, grinding battle against their own side was the first war they had to win. The work itself was a unique form of torture, a test of pure mental endurance. It was not the swashbuckling adventure seen in movies. It was a grueling, monotonous, and relentless grind. Young women, many just 20 or 21 years old, sat at long tables under harsh fluorescent lights for 12-hour shifts, 6 or even 7 days a week. They did this for months, sometimes years on end. Their task was to stare at endless pages of jumbled letters and 5-digit number groups, hunting for the faintest flicker of a non-random pattern. They used pencils and graph paper, performing complex statistical analyses and frequency counts entirely by hand. The eye strain was agonizing, the mental exhaustion profound. But the hardest part was the secrecy. This was the one rule that was absolute and non-negotiable. They were forbidden from speaking about their work to anyone. They could not tell their parents, their brothers or fiancés on the front lines, or even each other if they worked in different sections. The government's ubiquitous loose lips sink ships posters were a constant, menacing reminder of the stakes. This intense, shared pressure and profound isolation, however, had an unintended consequence. It forged an incredibly powerful bond among the women. They lived together in crowded dormitories near Arlington Hall, ate together in the cafeteria, and worked together in these high-stress, secretive rooms. They were all in the same boat, bearing the same burden. This shared experience created a unique, secret sisterhood. They developed their own slang, their own inside jokes, and their own methods of blowing off steam. This camaraderie became their only support system, but it was more than just social. It became their professional advantage. Unlike the competitive, siloed male units, the women fostered a highly collaborative environment. They would discreetly check each other's work, offer fresh eyes on a stubborn problem, and celebrate their small, incremental victories among themselves, knowing no one else would. This collective trust and collaborative spirit, born of necessity and isolation, empowered them. It gave them the confidence to trust their own findings, to push back against their dismissive superiors, and to continue their hunt for the enemy's secrets, even when they were told they were wasting their time. This secret sisterhood, working in the shadows, was about to get its first undeniable public-facing victory, though the public would never know. This is the story of Operation Pastorius. In June of 1942, in a plot authorized by Hitler himself, 2 groups of Nazi saboteurs were dispatched via U-boat to the American homeland. One group of 4 landed on Long Island, New York, and the other in Florida. They were loaded with explosives, cash, and a 2-year mission to destroy critical American infrastructure: factories, aluminum plants, bridges, and railway junctions. It was a terrifying escalation of the war, a direct attack on the mainland. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were thrown into a state of panic, desperate to find the agents before they could strike. But while the FBI was scrambling for leads on the ground, the women at Arlington Hall were already on their trail. Working on the German Abwehr, or intelligence codes, the female cryptanalysts had been sifting through thousands of seemingly mundane messages. They began to notice patterns, connecting disparate pieces of information. They painstakingly decrypted communications that detailed the training of the saboteurs, their mission objectives, their target list, and even their aliases. While the FBI was publicly claiming credit for rounding up the spy ring, a capture that was only initiated because one of the saboteurs lost his nerve and turned himself in, it was the women at Arlington Hall who provided the hard, actionable intelligence that confirmed the entire scope of the plot, identified the members of the network, and proved to a skeptical White House that the threat was chillingly real. This was the turning point. It was a massive, irrefutable win. This wasn't theoretical, academic code-breaking. This was intelligence that had directly stopped a Nazi attack on American soil. The military brass who had dismissed the women's work were forced to stop and listen. They could not dismiss this as feminine intuition. It was a cold, hard, decrypted fact. This victory, though shrouded in secrecy, began to slowly shift the tide, proving the offensive power of the Arlington Hall girls and earning them for the first time a reluctant seat at the table. The Pastorius breakthrough was the crack in the dam, and it opened the floodgates. With a newfound, if grudging, respect, the military leadership began to trust the women with more complex and critical intercepts, and the Sisterhood delivered on an industrial scale. The statistical proof of their success, when finally declassified, is staggering. The women of Arlington Hall, along with their smaller Navy counterparts, became the central nervous system of the entire Allied war effort. They broke the German diplomatic cipher, Enigma G, which allowed the Allies to read the private messages of the German ambassador in Dublin, who was helpfully reporting on Allied ship movements and D-Day preparations. They tackled the weather codes used by U-boats in the Atlantic, decrypting their transmissions to pinpoint the locations of wolf packs, allowing Allied convoys to be rerouted and hunter-killer groups to be dispatched. This contribution was a decisive factor in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. They weren't just focused on Europe, they made monumental breakthroughs against the Japanese. They broke the Japanese Army's shipping codes, allowing the U.S. Navy to know the exact routes and manifests of Japanese supply ships. This knowledge enabled American submarines to systematically starve the Japanese war machine, sinking so much of their merchant marine that their armies in the field were left without bullets, food, or fuel. The sheer scale of the operation is the most telling fact. Before the war, the Army's SIS was a tiny office of fewer than 200 people. By 1945, the Army's Signal Security Agency, centered at Arlington Hall, employed over 10,000 people. And of that number, nearly 7,000, a staggering 70%, were women. This was not a sideshow. This was not a clerical pool. Women were the American code-breaking effort. They had built the world's most powerful intelligence-gathering operation from scratch, and they were its primary workforce, its primary analytical minds, and its most effective secret weapon. To truly understand the weight of this work, we have to move beyond the statistics and tell the personal story of one of these women. Let's talk about Anne Cara Christie. She was a 1942 graduate of Vassar College, recruited in one of those first, quiet, secretive campus meetings. She arrived at Arlington Hall as a 21-year-old liberal arts major and was immediately put to work not on glamorous diplomatic codes, but on the most tedious, complex, and seemingly useless intercepts: the Japanese Army's logistical codes. These were not high-level strategy messages. They were the mundane, day-to-day communications about troop movements, supply requisitions, and shipping manifests, all encrypted in a complex 5-digit numerical system. For months, she and her small team worked in a poorly lit room, drowning in a sea of numbers. But Kara Christie possessed the exact mind Friedman had been searching for. She had a unique, almost artistic ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. She and her team didn't just break a code. They did something far more brilliant. They slowly, painstakingly reconstructed the entire Japanese Army's logistical system, its order of battle, and its supply routes, all from these low-level intercepts. Her work, combined with that of her colleagues, was what allowed American commanders in the Pacific to know where the Japanese Army was, where it was moving, and, most critically, where it was weakest. She was, in essence, reading the enemy's mind. The emotional toll of this work was immense. Anne knew, as she sat at her desk in Virginia, that the numbers she circled on a piece of paper would be translated into a military order that would lead to a submarine sinking a ship, killing hundreds of Japanese soldiers. She was wielding the power of life and death every single day from thousands of miles away. And yet when she clocked out, she was just a government girl, dismissed by the officers she passed in the hall, and bound by an oath of secrecy that forced her to carry that unimaginable burden completely alone. The climax of the women's work came in the final decisive years of the war. Their intelligence, particularly from the broken Japanese codes, was instrumental in planning the successful island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, and in identifying the fanatical resistance Allied forces would face. Their contribution to the D-Day landings, by protecting the secret of the invasion's location from German intelligence, was incalculable. They had read the enemy's mail, they knew their plans, and they had helped guide the Allies to a total and complete victory. They were heroes, and they expected, rightfully, to be recognized. They anticipated parades, medals, public speeches, or at the very least a formal thank you from a grateful nation. They received the exact opposite. This was the final, devastating betrayal. The moment the war ended, with the surrenders of Germany and Japan, the Iron Curtain of secrecy did not lift. It fell around the women of Arlington Hall. The U.S. government, realizing the immense strategic value of signals intelligence in the new Cold War that was already beginning, made a ruthless calculation. The code-breaking program was now America's greatest secret, and it had to be protected at all costs. The women were brought into offices, one by one, and read the Riot Act. They were forced to sign new, more terrifying oaths, swearing them to lifelong absolute secrecy. They were told that if they ever spoke about anything they did or saw at Arlington Hall, even to their husbands, their children, or even to each other, they would be tried for treason, imprisoned, and publicly shamed. They were sent home unceremoniously, with no veteran status, no benefits, and no public acknowledgement of any kind. Their service was erased. They were forbidden from putting their incredible, world-changing experience on a resume. They were just former secretaries. The men they worked for, the officers whose careers they had made, went on to found the National Security Agency, to write carefully redacted memoirs, and to receive government pensions. The women, the heart of the entire operation, were told to forget. It was as if the last 4 years of their lives and their critical role in winning the war had never even happened. The legacy of this betrayal was a profound silence that lasted for more than 50 years. The history books of World War II were written with a giant, gaping hole. The story of Allied intelligence was told as the story of brilliant men in Bletchley Park and Washington. The women of Arlington Hall, bound by their oaths, kept their promise. They did not talk. They raised families, became teachers or librarians, and never spoke of the days and nights they spent hunting U-boats or stopping saboteurs. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s, with the final declassification of World War II-era files, that the truth finally began to spill out. Historians and authors like Liza Mundy began the painstaking work of finding these women, now in their 70s and 80s, and for the first time recording their stories. What emerged was a secret history that fundamentally changed our understanding of the war. Their legacy is twofold. First, they literally built the foundation of the modern American intelligence machine. The methods, the culture, and the infrastructure of Arlington Hall became the bedrock of the National Security Agency, the most powerful surveillance organization on Earth. Anne Cara Christie, that Vassar recruit, stayed on, rising through the ranks to become the first female deputy director of the NSA in 1980, a living testament to the capabilities of the Sisterhood. Second, their performance on an industrial scale shattered the conventional wisdom of who could be an analyst, who could be a spy, and who could handle the pressures of high-stakes intellectual warfare. Their ultimate delayed recognition rewrote a crucial and long-hidden chapter of American history. The story of America's secret sisterhood is a powerful testament to the fact that some of the most decisive battles of World War II were not fought on the front lines with bullets and bombs, but in the quiet, crowded rooms of Arlington Hall. The intellectual war waged by these women, a war fought against both the Nazi regime's most complex ciphers and their own military's suffocating prejudice, reveals the true, complex, and often hidden face of American heroism. Theirs was a silent victory, stolen by secrecy and betrayal. But it was a victory that saved countless lives and secured the Allied triumph.